Hi everyone. Today we are joined by Fanny Talagrand, Head of EMEA Sales for Startups and SMB at Stripe, that payments company you may well have heard of, a global powerhouse helping millions of businesses scale their operations seamlessly. With a background spanning product, strategy, and customer engagement, Fanny brings a unique lens to the table, having worked with startups and enterprises alike to unlock growth and tackle go-to-market challenges head on. And then prior to joining Stripe, Fanny spent a decade at Google Cloud, so she has an amazing wealth of experience to share with us all from two hugely successful tech companies. Fanny, welcome. We're so delighted to have you here with us today.
No, thank you for having me. I'm always delighted to chat about all things founders, go-to-market motions, and scaling businesses. So it's a pleasure.
Before we dive in, we'd just love for you to share a little bit more about your role and your experiences across those two juggernaut companies.
Yeah, super happy. So my career started a little bit by accident, and I always like to tell the story of, I went to business school and I was convinced I was going to work in strategic consultancy and join McKinsey, Bain, etc., all those big consultancy firms. And actually, I did my Erasmus in Dublin, and at the time, I had graduated, and the tech sector was really booming in Ireland. There was a lot of tech companies implanting in Ireland. And I thought I'd love to get into a sales experience, do this for a year, get my English to a good professional level, and then I'll join a consultancy firm. And turned out I absolutely loved the tech sector. It was not even cloud computing at the time, so it was software. And I actually really enjoyed talking to users, figuring out what was the solution that we could propose to them to help grow their business. And one thing after the other, I actually moved into, so I started a company called BMC Software. And then a few years down the line, I joined Google Cloud in 2011. And at the time, Google Cloud was this big bet for Google, but we were a very, very small team. And so I saw that unit completely scale over my 10 years then, and I was an account executive, and then I started being a sales manager. And then at the end of this experience, I was responsible for the go-to-market motion for Google Cloud Platform for startup and SMBs across the EMEA region. And I had spent 10 years in cloud computing at this point in time, and I thought the fintech industry was incredibly interesting. And so I had always said, actually, when I was in Google, I would only leave Google to go work at Stripe because I thought that company was incredibly impressive, from their founders to how they completely revolutionized the industry that they were in. And so I had the opportunity to join Stripe 3 years and a half ago. Again, various roles, various regions and business units. And now I have the pleasure of running the startup and SMB team go-to-market for EMEA. And yeah, it's incredible. I love chatting to startups and founders about what they're up to and how Stripe fits into that journey. And so I feel like I have experiences in scaling businesses. That's the part of the business I enjoy the most. And I think as soon as it gets a bit steady state, I look for my next opportunity. And there is no shortage of this at Stripe at the moment, which is really exciting.
That's amazing. I mean, what a joy to have two such loved companies to
That's
be
right.
a part of. And look, both Google Cloud and Stripe provide the critical pieces of infrastructure for startups, and startups are building their businesses on top of these products. What are some of the similarities and then also some of the differences about selling to startups specifically at both Google Cloud and at Stripe?
Yeah, I would say probably what's common across Google Cloud is Stripe, and startups in particular is, I think, what's important to a startup is obviously how the product is working today and functionalities, etc. But I think it's the journey that we're able to take people on. And for a startup to think today Stripe is the right choice for me or Google Cloud, and in 10 years it will still be Google Cloud and Stripe. And what's common about those two companies is really the vision of being the best products for what they're doing and the best solutions. And so what's common is really understanding what's a startup ambition. And maybe they don't know. And I think being able to say to them, hey, if you change your business model a million times, we'll still be there because we've built a platform. That's not just in the case of Stripe, a card payment provider, but really thinking about all the fund flows that you may want to support and how you monetize. So I would say really thinking about startups on a journey. And I think in both cases, you need to show what that journey looks like with a technology partner. I think the piece that's maybe a little bit different is maybe when startups feel like they need to look at that piece of the infrastructure. And I think Google Cloud probably earlier in the journey, because a lot of the bricks are product foundations when you think about Google Cloud and how you're going to build your product. And I think on maybe the financial infrastructure, what's interesting is that startups tend to come to us a little bit later. So they've gone a little bit further into how they build their product, then they say, okay, now we want to see how we're going to monetize it. And actually, it is important to engage as early as possible, because the way you're building your fund flows and your monetization is actually like very, very intricately linked to your product. And so I would say there's probably this conception that it is something that we'll see later, but I actually think there's a lot of value on engaging early to make sure the architecture that you're building, the product that you're building is also like from day one ready to monetize globally. And I think we're hearing from VCs and from founders as well that there's a lot more onus on how you're going to monetize. What's the addressable market share that you're going after? How is it going to move into your plan? So I think there's a lot more focus on that from VCs. And so I would say like really important to see this piece as an early engagement and foundational structure to your company as well.
Yeah, we can definitely attest to that. Lots of focus on monetization and
Yes.
revenue generation
Yes.
right now, which is no bad thing. And then look, Google has one of the most admired engineering organizations, and also arguably Stripe have done an incredible job on that sort of things and really building such a developer-friendly product. What were some of the key learnings you took from working with engineering teams at Google?
Yeah, I think both for Google and Stripe, the bar is incredibly high for engineering talent. So I would say definitely something I take away is they are very capable engineers, but I think being able to have this vision of what we want the solution to look like in 5, 10 years, I think is a bar of your engineering as well. And are you able to bring people that are visionaries and are just not thinking about the problems that you're solving today, but the problems you'll be solving in 5 years' time and further down, I think is really important. The other thing I would say is how the companies have built around engineering. I think it's very clear that both of those companies are product focused. And I think you see it in the way the company works in terms of how annual planning is done, really focusing around product, addressable market. And I think also the feedback loops are structured and how the decisions are made as well, with product being a very integral part of the feedback that we're receiving from users, but also the decisions that we're making in terms of where are we going to focus as a company. It's very, very deep with products. And I think I've been in companies where those teams are operating a little bit more independently and actually they kind of have equal importance in a company, be it like the revenue versus the product. But I think in engineering-led companies, the focus is definitely on what are our users telling us about the product? Are we building the best product that's out there? And are we building the best product for what's going to come in the next 5 to 10 years? And it shows by the investments that you make in your engineering population as well, in terms of having the best people, but also having the capacity to deliver on your ambition. And it's a very philosophical, I think, way to run the business. And that's, I think, served those companies very well from both trajectories.
Yeah, certainly the user feedback that engineering has to take into account to make a product that delights users makes selling the product so much easier.
Yeah. And I think as well to add on it, and it's more anecdotal, but if you think about like our product leaders across the business, they are meeting users all the time. And that's something that they've prioritized very highly in terms of how much of my time is internal focus, how much of my time is external focused. And so while it's anecdotal, I think it also really shows the eagerness for product to connect with our users and really understand what are people saying. And that's also where you get your best ideas in terms of where the product needs to go next. And there's a question we always ask our users when we meet them, and especially when we have product folks in the room, is, what's the next thing that you would love Stripe to build for you? What are the things that you still find hard to do or that you feel like your developer time should not be allocated to? And you get like absolutely great insights from those companies, and it makes you think, well, maybe that's the next thing we should be building and evaluating that. So I think it's also an investment of time to connect with your user base and making sure that feedback gets reviewed, prioritized, and into our overall planning.
I think that's a great key insight that's useful not only for large organizations, but also small companies. Some founders think, once I hire a salesperson and a sales team, my job is done working with the customer. And what you're sharing, it's clearly not the case. Having your finger on the pulse of the voice of the customer is key to product development.
Yeah, super important.
So PLG is a term that I really dislike. As somebody who's been in sales roles, this term product-led growth is the idea that, hey, the product sells itself. And there are lots of great product-led growth companies, Stripe, Twilio, Atlassian, companies where the product is easy to use, developers get their hands on it, and they don't need to talk to a salesperson for a free trial or demo the way some legacy enterprise companies worked. But all of those companies have sales teams. The product doesn't just sell themselves. So why do these companies even have sales teams?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the premise of this is beautiful, right? Because what you're thinking about is my product is going to bring so much value to people that use it that somehow my sales team are those users, and they're going to chat to their friends and the developer communities and say, this is absolutely amazing and we need to use it. And that's very much Stripe's DNA. If you think about when John and Patrick first created Stripe, they used to go around with their computer and saying, try it, sign up. And they would watch people sign up and use the product and hear what they were thinking. And I think the assumption is, the product will be so good that it will propagate itself. And I think it did for Stripe very much at the beginning. It was a while before there was a sales team at Stripe. But if you think about this curve adoption and you have the innovators and that moves, you cross the chasm. I don't know if you're familiar with that adoption curve. I think most people are, right? And I think it only takes you so far that the innovators will hear from it and will use the product, and you'll get to a certain stage. And if you think about the next phase of the adoption, people sometimes need a bit more support to actually really understand what the solution is bringing them, what it's bringing to their business as well, because you will maybe start getting into zones where it's not as easy to implement because you are a bigger company or you have more integrations that you need support on, and it becomes like less straightforward. So I absolutely agree with the first part, which I think is foundational to any great company, is let's create a product and a solution that is inherently beautiful and that people will use and talk about it and say you should use it. But if you want to scale and you want to go further, now is the question to think through, what's the support that you need to bring to the rest of your motion to make sure you go beyond those innovators and go probably towards populations that need a bit more education, that need a bit more support. And that would benefit actually from either an account executive, salespeople, but also some solution architects. So once you get into this mid-market enterprise part of the business, it's not just sales that you need, it's actually people that are technical enough and understand the infrastructure that you're looking at and what you want to build. So I would say that complexity, I think, changes. I agree with the premise, but I think at a point in time, it doesn't scale as much as probably if you want to. And thinking about market share, that's definitely when you need to think about the next cohort of users.
I like that framework of crossing the chasm, and that these early adopters are inherently tinkerers. They'll figure out the product themselves.
Yeah.
But as you said, once you get to this larger majority, there may need to be some education or even technical pre-sales resources. So given that framework, when you're managing your team, what are some of the key metrics that a sales team that's selling to startups or SMBs that they should be measuring against and optimizing for beyond just revenue, since education and evangelizing is so important?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because when people think about sales, they think about revenue, but revenue is an output metric, it's not an input metric. And so if you think about it, your revenue is increasing, that's great. But what is making your revenue increase or is decreasing in the case that you probably don't want to, and what's driving that? So what is important when you think about your sales funnel and how you measure the health of it is what are the steps in between that bring you to the revenue? And so what are the input metrics that will determine your revenue? And if you think about a fairly scaled motion, when you think about startups and SMBs, so a lot of them in size, they may be roughly the average size in terms of the volume they want to bring to Stripe, and the type of products they're going to use is thinking about that funnel of, are you creating, and I'm starting from the very beginning, right? Are you creating interest? Are you creating projects? Are you creating those conversations? Then how many customers are you evaluating this with? How many are we going to win? How many are not necessarily going to choose us? And then from the people that choose us, how well are they going to deploy your solutions? And so you have this like every step of the way of, if you think for an evaluation as a customer or a user would do, every stage needs to be mapped on metrics. And so you have a sense of, well, if I want to get to a Y in revenue, it means what the metrics need to look like in all of the funnel. And it is a funnel. So you need all those metrics to work very coherently together. It's like, for instance, if you're having a lot of conversation with people, but you're actually not managing to transfer them into actual projects, then either you change that metric and thinking about, okay, from those first conversations, what are we missing to actually move customers along the funnel, or you need to have a lot more conversations. And so that funnel is very interlinked together, and you can have a lot of different combinations to send you to the same revenue number. But that's only when you do that you understand at which stage actually do we need to do better, or we're not able to capture the right information or show the right value. So you can think about obviously optimizing every step of that funnel so you can increase your revenue further on the line.
I like that. Revenue is a lagging indicator.
It is a lagging indicator. Plus, if you have a startup that's a consumption model, that's even more lagging. Whereas if you have a SaaS structure and people sign contracts with you and they pay from day one, Again, that's lagging, but it's a little bit closer. And consumption can also vary. You can have people that really want to go on Google Cloud, for instance, and they say, hey, we're going to do all those things. And then at the end of the day, if they don't consume your product, then you probably realize that 6 months down the line. So it's important you have this mapping of each stage of the funnel metrics.
So, given that education, as you said, with a variable cost and consumption model requires more projects, more education on the customer side, help us understand the difference between selling to SMBs and startups versus selling to large enterprise, and specifically maybe in your management style for deal review. So, if you're in a super enterprise named account team, maybe you have 10 accounts that you're working the whole year. And so a deal review might be an hour, 2 hours, just talking about one single customer and all the stakeholders.
Yeah.
How do you conduct deal reviews for salespeople who might have 100+ accounts that they're managing?
Yeah, it's very different. And in fairness, they're two very different motions. I would say startups and SMB, you're going to talk to a lot of startups, but I would say the good news is you're going to be chatting to a founder really quickly. You're able to talk with CTO founders. And I would say through that evaluation, have a really good sense of, is my solution the right fit for them? Is it not? You know, what are the next steps we put in place? And usually also startups are pretty quick to decide. They don't really have time. They're not going to sit on an evaluation for 6 months. They want to move fast and they want to be agile. And so I would say in that case, the deal review is very much on what's the founder vision, how we align to this, what's the value that we bring to the startup, how is it going to scale for their journey, etc. If you think for an enterprise deal and like a very large deal, a salesperson would have much fewer pool of accounts, right? To your point, like probably not more than 10 accounts, but inside one account sits 20 accounts, right? Because the power map of the account and the stakeholder map is very different. So you would have, I would say, like multiple companies within one company, and you need to be able to position on who are the decision makers, but also who are they influenced with, how you do build a value proposition across all of those different businesses. And so what changes the depth of what you need to do within that account, like the structure is much more complicated, and you need to spend more time on the mapping of the account and the different teams that are within that account and the influencing, like who's influencing the decision and who's participating. And you really need to build consensus in the account. Whereas in startups, you have the founder, the CTO, they will make the decision. But in the case of a much more matrix organization, I would say the complexity is different. So in a deal review, I would say, what's the landscape of the account? How have we mapped it? What's the different perception of the business units? You'd go into a lot more of that depth. So I would say it's like you're almost running 10 sales cycles at the same time for one opportunity, if that makes sense. But at the end of the day, it is about building value for users. And it's about, if you were the CEO of that company or if you were the decision maker, and you were looking at this information, like what's being surfaced, is it the right choice for your company? And so I think that doesn't change on the value selling and being able to go from a problem or a challenge that a user is facing versus being able to say, this is what we can help you do. And also, I think sometimes being honest on maybe we're not the right choice at this point in time for you as a company, and that's fine as well. So very centered around value and business value for user, especially like in the times that we are now where funding is very much indexed on profitability, but it's the same for large companies, and thinking about what's the ROI of using those solutions, I think is across the board.
How do companies think about what the right go-to-market motion is going to be? Like, is it possible to do both product-led growth and enterprise sales at the same time? And have you seen that work? Have you seen it not?
Yeah, I think you can, absolutely. And if you think about large tech companies, that's what they've done. And they've been able to cater to both of those users. I think if you want to be successful, you do need to see those businesses as different within your company and thinking about who are the users we can capture with product-led growth and who are the users that we're not going to be able to capture. And it's back to the journey that I was chatting about on, you know, if you think about a certain type of users, that's going to be like, what's the user journey you're designing for them, I think is what's really important. And when you start looking at a user that's like fundamentally very different, I think it's unrealistic to say they're going to go through the same user journey and we're going to see great success. So when you think about your ideal customer profile, and maybe you have a few, what's the journey that you want for each of them? And what should it look like to them? And does it match with how they usually evaluate those kind of solutions? How would you compare to competition? So I think very deep user journey work is important when you want to do things that are fundamentally different. And at the end of the day, if your product is not great, you won't sell it to enterprise either, right? So alpha and omega is obviously you need to have a great product, But I think when you think about user journeys and how people evaluate solutions, being able to differentiate and think about the different motions that you need to have and what do they need to be supported. If you think through maybe more an enterprise motion, you will probably have a lot more resources on implementation, solution architecture, because an enterprise has very deep integrations with internal processes that they may have built. They may be of a size as well. That makes those implementations fairly challenging, and you need to make sure like you support them in the right way. Whereas if you have a startup that's just being created, they will be absolutely fine using your product and they will have a beautiful user journey, but that wouldn't be true of an enterprise. And they would have actually a very fragmented user journey if you don't change the way you build this for them.
Naturally, it's hard at the beginning of the journey to get both of those motions working together seamlessly, right? So if you're giving advice to an earlier stage founder or somebody who's looking to scale up, when is the right time to start thinking about layering on that enterprise motion? Like, what are the signs that determine there's a readiness from the startup to start tackling that?
Yeah. I think it's hard, honestly, because every startup is different in the way they're building and they're growing. But I would say probably enterprises, a lot of upfront investments, and I would say probably multi-year return. So from the base that you're starting on, I think from a financial standpoint, you need to be able to say, we're going to bet on enterprise and we're going to make a lot of investment up front. And actually, it's going to take time to see those investments pay off. And I think if you're on that trajectory, you can definitely do that. But I think it's definitely a trickier financial position to say, hey, let's invest in enterprise, because it does take time and those sales cycles are much longer, deployment much longer. Whereas I think if you start in a segment like startups, SMBs, things just go faster. People make decisions faster, they implement things faster. And so if you're looking for this, I think is important. The other thing as well, the benefit I think of starting with startups and SMBs is you're going to get a lot of feedback really quickly. And actually, when you think about enterprises, I deeply think that what they're looking for in terms of product is what startups are looking for. They want to learn from startups. Their probably main concern is, are we moving the ship fast enough? Because obviously, as you become to be a much bigger company, a much bigger ship, and it takes time to move. And your competition might be smaller companies, much more agile. They're able to respond to trends and customer feedback much faster. And so I think at the end of the day, you want to use what startup use as an enterprise because you want to get that agility from the market. And if you see startups leveraging it, you're like, oh, maybe there's something for me. So I think you also have this value to bring to enterprise users once you have a very good trajectory on the startup and the SMB segment. But that being said, I've seen startups doing really well in enterprise, and that's where they start because that's where their product is actually bringing the most value. So it's definitely not one size fits all, but I think having a sense of the investment and how long it will take for you to see return on those investments, I think is an important piece to think about when you think about startups, SMB versus enterprise adoption.
For sure, that the timeframes are just so different. And kind of building on your point that it's not just one size fits all, how do you think about that also in terms of the types of sales leader you need? So do you need a different type of person if you're going after product-led growth versus an enterprise motion?
Yeah, it's a good question. And also, I talk with a lot of founders around when do you hire your first salesperson? What do they need to look like? And actually, a lot of successful startups that I've chatted with, I see a lot of co-founders actually. I see a lot fewer people going at it alone, if that makes sense. The best combination I've seen is a very CTO, CRO focus in two founders, where you have someone who's much more focused on the business and maybe one of a founder that's much more focused on the product. So I would say that's to start with. I think it's a really good combination. But in terms of the profile that you need, I think there is something common across the profile of sales leader that you need. You need someone who's going to think forward for you in terms of not just, I'm able to drive revenue metrics, but also I'm able to think for what's our sales strategy for the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and how do I influence product to become that way. So I think that's common across if you want to do startup or enterprise, because you need to be highly differentiated. And I think you need someone who's very resilient and able to operate in an environment where there aren't a lot of processes and everything is very flexible. But in terms of enterprise versus startups, I think in terms of the experience that you look for, and it goes back to understanding those user journeys and how user evaluate is, I would say you have an advantage for people who have done this before and able to leverage insights from work that they've done on those segments. Not to say you can't, sell in enterprise if you've been more of a startup and SMB leader. But if you think through someone who's seen those trajectories before, know what you need to care about from day one, with enterprise versus with startups and SMB, I think is definitely an asset depending on the customer profiles that you want to go for. in terms of just accelerating the speed of your learning and having someone who's done it before. But like only caveat is you do need someone who will thrive in a startup world. And I think sometimes if you hire people that have been in like very structured environment, sometimes it's really hard for them to go on in the startup world, even though they say they will love it and they're looking for that challenge. It's actually like quite hard. So I would say like probably a mix of, do they understand that those customers really well? And have they been able to demonstrate impact in a very high-paced environment where there is not a ton of processes, there is not a ton of structure, and I think it can be unsettling for some people.
That makes total sense. Even if somebody's excited to operate
Yes.
in a resource-constrained environment where you don't have many people to help you, if they're used to having those resources, they may not know how to be clever and scrappy in the same way.
Yeah, and I think the scrappiness is real, like very real. When you have a startup and everyone is a jack of all trades, you also need people that are able to be very product focused and then very sales focused. And especially at the beginning of your journey, you need people that have this jack of all trade mentality and I think experience versus there's only one thing I know how to do may not be the right profile when you start out. And then I think when you scale, you can get people that are like very specialized on a particular thing that you want to do, but it depends on where you are in your journey. And as you build out your business, it is very likely you'll have a head of startup and SMB, and then you'll have a head of enterprise in your business, right? Once you scale. And those people will be laser focused on the users that they're serving and thinking about what that looks like. But I think that comes a little bit later. And to begin with, you need someone who's able to think very strategically and in a very scrappy resource constrained environment.
And finding these people is hard, and making the right hiring choice is hard. So when a founder has decided it's time to make their first sales hire, the rate of mishire can be high. And so if you were giving advice to a founder about how to interview, what questions would you tell a founder to use in their interview for the first sales hire?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we use a lot of written assignments, and I've used written assignments in multiple companies. I think it's actually a very good leveling for candidates for you to say, you're going to join this organization as sales leader, build a sales strategy for the next 5 years, right? And I think from there, you will have a really good sense of the level of what people are thinking. Are they thinking very tactically? Are they thinking strategically? Are they able to think both ways? And I think also in terms of what are the resources they're going to use for that strategy. And I think like making that part of your assignment of how you're going to bring this strategy to life. And you'll see people that are saying, well, I need to hire a lot of people. And you'll see people that are saying, I think there are economies of scale and we could have an approach that's really scrappy as well. So I love that as a mechanism of leveling your candidates. So it goes beyond a discussion. You actually have this. The other thing I would say is have people do it with you. People that you trust, people that, maybe work in other companies. They don't necessarily need to be in your startups. But I think also getting a sense from your community of people that have hired great salespeople before, I think is important that it's not just like your sole decision. I think it's always important to have more people in that evaluation because we are biased towards some profiles. So I think that's important. In terms of the questions, you need to think about what you need from this person for the next 3 years, right? And think about maybe reverse engineering and say, in 3 years' time, if someone was asking me, what has this person achieved and what are the attributes that they've displayed, what would you say? And then I think really using scenario-based questions to say, well, tell me about a time where you faced a really tough situation and you didn't have the right resources. How did you look at this? And that can be like a very good example of scrappiness, as we were chatting about. So I would say, what are the 3 things that you need this person to do really well? And really probing on not just what would you do, but also what have you done in the past. So you can see what's their thought process. And also like in real situations, how did they react to things that maybe were tough or what sometimes there was no clear solution and how did they solve for that? I think will give you a really good sense of this. And then I think the last piece on sales is how passionate are they about users and customers? You need to find someone who's like really motivated to build something beautiful for their users and customers and really understanding the needs of every single person they're going to chat to make sure this is aligned to the value they can provide when they're talking about their own solution. So I would say probably those things. And then the last thing I would say, and it's not necessarily sales hire, but it's something I've used throughout my career, is I have a bit of a mental model on any hire that I make. I've got that advice from a very good friend when I started hiring is, are the people that you're hiring smart? Are they driven? Are they coachable? And if you're missing any of those, it's actually really hard to make someone successful. And if you have someone who is 3 of them, it's actually really hard for them to fail because they will always figure it out if they have displaying those 3 attributes. So that's a bit of a mental model I have. And it's not just sales hire. I think it's across all the people that you work with. Coachability, I think, is an important one as well, where you can have someone who's incredibly smart and driven, but if they're not open to feedback, at some stage their growth will stall, because that's a way where you get, I think, the most growth in your professional career as you grow in role and scope, and being able to incorporate feedback. So that's my secret sauce, I would say.
Oh,
And it
that's
serves
cool.
me well.
I've never heard that framework, smart, driven, and coachable, but it makes total sense. And when I think about the most successful people I've worked with, they've displayed all three of those attributes. And I like this idea of in an interview setting, giving scenario-based questions, but also asking for their big vision. And so when you structure a hiring process, how do you do that? Do you divide and conquer those responsibilities? Do you, as you said, all of us have a bias towards maybe a certain type of candidate. So how do you make sure you get other voices in the room? And when you're interviewing, what are some clear signs that this person will be a top performer?
So on your question on surrounding yourself, I think it's important you have, like, we usually have 3 to 4 people span on roles. And here I think it's important that you have diversity of opinions, backgrounds, and also work preferences. Someone who's like fairly different than you and how you operate. So I think like once you have this diverse pool of trusted interviewers, usually what we do is we would define the 3, 4 areas that are really important for us to assess, and then each of us would take one. So we would able to go like really deep into each of those areas. So that went back to what I was saying. If you have the 3, 4 attributes that you really want to get a good sense on, give them to one person in particular, and then they're able to drill really deep into this attribute. I think like obviously the depth of the question is really important, and the content of what people are saying. But I would say usually the structure that I see from successful candidates is, especially like when we think about scenarios-based question, is the ability to be honest and saying, I experienced an issue and that was hard, but this is what I did and this is what I learned from it. And I think that goes back to the coachability. And so if people are able to show you they had a tough problem, they were very ambitious, they were scrappy, and they learned from it, then you know that is a process that's just going to continue through their experience. And I think when you see people that have this growth mindset, I know everyone probably is familiar with the concept, is I think that's how you see that growth mindset really coming in interviews as well, where people are able to really show the work they do on themselves to become better and to learn and to welcome feedback. And I think like the questions where you see people not being so good, I would say, is if they had a problem and say, well, you know, it was this person's fault, and seeing them not take ownership necessarily of solving the problem, and maybe them saying, well, it was a different team and it was this responsibility. I think that's when, you know, could those people be top performers? Maybe, but I don't know if it comes across in this type of situations where you don't take ownership and you don't display high agency. I think they're probably red flags in terms of how would you cope then in an environment that is very flexible and resource constraints, and you're going to be ending up doing like a lot more outside of your job, the job spec that you've been hired for. And that's the beauty of it, I think, when you work in a startup, is being able to bring that impact across multiple areas of the business. And that's what you need as well from a sales leader, for them to work on product strategy, to spend time with users, and really think beyond, I'm just here to bring revenue to the company. You need more than that.
Yeah, that mindset's so important. Fanny, I want to talk now about onboarding. And what do you think is the best like structure for how new sales hires should be onboarded?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like it's very dependent on the product or the solution that you're looking at. The more complex, I would say, the more support you need in acquiring that knowledge. If you think about Stripe in particular, money movement is an incredibly complex industry. And so as part of onboarding, we spend a lot of time educating new joiners on the industry, the challenges that companies are facing. There's a lot of regulation in our space as well. So there's a lot of content that you need to go through to be able to understand really well users and understand how Stripe can fit in, especially as we're not just doing payments, it's the whole money movement piece, from subscription models to how do you become a platform. So it's very complex, and I would depend on the solution. The other piece I would say on onboarding is spend as much time with users to begin with. What I wouldn't recommend is, you know, you have a new joiner and they spend a lot of time researching the product for, say, 1 month or so, and actually then they speak to users. In Stripe, we embed people very early on. They can be on calls with other account executives and they can meet users. And I think that's how you'll get like a lot of how it fits in together. So I think you almost need to do those in parallel, which is like hear a lot about what the user's saying, do your work on the product, and then that's how things will click into themselves, and then you really get to a good level of understanding of your users and the market, and also how Stripe and your solution can fit in those journeys.
Obviously, it's different for every company, and embedding with the customer, as you say, is integral at Stripe. But are there other tools, materials, or resources that founders can provide to help shorten that ramp time for new AEs?
Yeah, I think it also depends where you are in that journey, right? Because if you start through very early scale, tribal knowledge is probably okay because people are very close to each other. They learn very intuitively, etc. Once you get to a team size that's much bigger, you need to think about what's the right way to onboard them as quickly as possible. And I think it is the product knowledge, but also it's all the things they're going to do on the job and how do you make that as quickly as possible. And so that goes a lot to the enablement quality of what you're providing. And at some stage, you will need to have a pretty good onboarding program and enablement, which is content that are like webinar based or that you can reuse, etc. So I think as you scale, you need things that are a lot more scalable so that you have a new joiner and they log in into their computer and they have their 30 days mapped out and you know exactly what's the right pace for them on what they need to know on day 10 versus what they need to know on day 20, and having this parallel like shadowing user embedding. And so I think there's a point where the tribal knowledge has its limits. Some companies push it further and they wait until they're at a very critical size. But I would say that's what you need to evaluate as well and say, well, from the way we're operating, how long does it take for someone to be productive and being able to do X, Y, Z? And then, it's an ROI model, right? If you were able to cut that out by X, what's the value you bring to your company? And then obviously the enablement is a cost that you need to factor in on. When you build those enablement paths, that requires work and resources as well. So I always keep an eye on when tribal knowledge has run its course and when it's time to invest on very solid enablement, self-serve programs where you don't always need someone to educate the next person who's joining.
Makes total sense. And then Fanny, any red flags to end up on? What's the single biggest mistake that founders make in the onboarding of new sales reps?
Wow, it's hard to find one. I'm having a thing. What's the biggest mistake? I think like what I was chatting about before is not embedding, like keeping them on internal focused onboarding for too long, I think is like where I see the biggest mistake. People are left on their own and say, hey, in a month's time, we'll check back in and hopefully you're ready to go, right? And I think it is important as well because you also want to convince people that this is the right place for them. And so I think it's, you don't necessarily to be super hands-on, but I think it's always worth thinking about what do the first 30 days, 60 days are going to look like for those people? Are they going to be energized? Are they going to learn things? Are we going to get them to understand our users deeply? Because it's not only like they need to be onboarded and productive, but they also need to really be excited about the mission that they're going to be on, etc. So I would say maybe, a single mistake is I'll let them do their thing, and in 2 months' time, I'll have a chat with them again, or I'll check back in and being, okay, now that this salesperson is hired, let me pivot completely over onto product. And maybe underestimating how much those first 30 days are really critical for a hire to be successful and also to be like really bought into the success and the trajectory of the company. I don't know if it's specific enough, but that's my sense.
I think it's really important to not leave someone on an island. Certainly, you don't want to micromanage them, but you also want to help them believe in the mission of the company, as you said, and you want to surround them with as many resources, whether it's just tribal knowledge or cross-functional help. You want to embed them in the company, and hopefully you'll have a longer tenure there.
And I think it's tempting, right? Because if you're a founder and you really stretch and suddenly you have this head of sales who's coming and you're like, great, that's it. I'm back into the product. You figure out the sales. It can work, don't get me wrong. You can get very talented people that are able to do this. But I think if you say, let me make sure like your 30 days are amazing, and at the end of the 30 days, you really feel equipped to do this well, and you bought into the mission, I think like you change the trajectory of what those hires can bring to your company, and also how bought in and passionate are they going to be of what's happening in that startups and the growth plans, etc.
That's such good advice. And thank you so much for the time, Fanny. I think I learned a lot about hiring. I loved your framework of smart, driven, and coachable. And I think a lot of founders will listen to this and get some good advice on doing PLG versus enterprise and also how to hire and make sure that their hires are set up for success.
It was a pleasure. And as I said, we love chatting to founders. So if anyone want to get in touch and chat about their startup, we're always happy to do that.
Thank you, Fanny.
Thanks, you. Fanny.